Greetings from Mesa United Methodist Church of Albuquerque, New Mexico. We hope this message will be meaningful and relevant to your life and your relationship with God. We invite you to join us for worship on Sunday mornings. Our traditional service is at 8:30 a.m. and at 11 a.m. we gather for contemporary worship. More information may be found at our website, mesaviewumc.com. Now may you be blessed through the reading and hearing of God's holy word.
The gospel reading this morning is from Matthew 14, verses 22 through 33. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. And he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the word of God for the people of God.
In the third chapter, all the way back at the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, after Adam and Eve have eaten from the fruits of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they hear God walking in the garden, and they hide from God. And God calls out to them, "Where are you?" And God eventually finds them and says, "Why were you hiding?" And they say, "We were afraid, so we hid from you." The relationship between God and humanity is forever changed. Before they've even left the garden, fear has entered into our story. When God asks why they are afraid, Adam says, "Don't blame me, the woman made me do it." And the woman says, "Don't look at me, it was the snake." And the snake sort of goes, "Eh?" I think that's the reason God removed the appendages for the snake, so it can no longer shrug its shoulders at God. Now he crawls around on his stomach. Fear and blame and refusal to do something come into the story at exactly the same time, and they come into the story very, very early. Today we begin embarking on a new sermon series, looking at what I'm calling the knots of Jesus. Fear not, doubt not, sin not, judge not, worry not. They're the knots of Jesus, not only because Jesus says, "Do not do them," but also because if we try and live them out, just try not to fear or worry, and you're going to tie yourself in knots. So they're the knots of Jesus. Andy Stanley has called these the end commandments, because Jesus considered them so important. And I'm obviously not going to argue they're not important, hence the reason I'm talking with them, but I do reject his idea that they're commandments. I think he came up with that because when we think of commandments, we think, "Thou shalt not." And that's where these fall. But when Jesus is asked what is the greatest commandment, he says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and strength and mind and soul, with all that you are." And the second is just like it, "Love your neighbor as yourself." Then on his last night, on Maundy Thursday, the reason we call it Maundy Thursday, it's the giving of a commandment. "You shall be known by the way that you love one another. This is the commandment I give to you. Love one another as I have loved you." And so when Jesus is talking about the commandments, he is normally talking in positive language. Do this, rather than do not do something. So we can look at the golden rule. And what Jesus says is, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." That's a positive enforcement of that rule. Compare that to how others have taken that statement, in particular Rabbi Hillel, who lived around the same time, who says, do not do to others what is hateful to you. Jesus says, do as you would have done to you. The inverse, the negative of that is do not do. Jesus tends to use more positive language in telling us how to live these things out. But we have these rules about the do nots. And the church does talk a lot about things that people should do not. That seems to be what we hear a lot from the church. Certainly people outside the church think that that's what we talk about. Is you shouldn't do this. But when we think about the things we say people shouldn't do, most of them are not the ones Jesus says we shouldn't do. Do not fear, do not doubt, do not sin, do not worry, do not judge. And so we're going to look at those do nots and see how it is that they apply in our lives and how they apply into us living into the commandments Jesus does say of loving the Lord our God and loving our neighbor as ourselves. So today we start with fear. First, because it comes into the story right at the beginning. And second, because it might be one of the hardest ones for us to try and overcome. Fear is a primal force. It comes from the oldest and most primitive part of our brain, the amygdala. It's right above the brain stem. It's really easy to trigger. It's where we get our fight or flight response. It's what has kept us alive as a species for millions of years. Fear is a good thing. We learn really early on, don't touch a hot stove and don't play in traffic. Why? Because it can hurt you. Fear can be an important force in our lives. There are things that we should be fearful of. Because there are some dangerous things in the world. It's not a sin to fear. The problem begins when the fear controls our lives and we can't push past that fear. I don't think that Jesus is saying you shouldn't fear things because that would just be stupid. It's dangerous not to fear things. It's how we deal with that fear. How do we overcome that fear? Jesus gives around 125 imperatives in the Gospels, and 21 of those are about do not be afraid, do not fear, or corollaries, have strength, have courage. The first thing we hear about when Jesus is coming, the angels appear, and what do they say? Fear not, don't be afraid. The first thing we hear about Jesus is don't be afraid. And so that sort of leads us to think that, well, in the Old Testament, that God was a scary, troublesome, punishing God. And Jesus comes along and says, no, you misunderstood. The God we have is a God of love and one that we're supposed to be, touchy-feely with. And that somehow they're almost two different gods, except when we look at Hebrew Scripture, we find the God we worship there too. And more than 100 times we also hear God or the angel saying, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Now, Max Lucado says, fear at its center is about a perceived loss of control. I'm not sure I'm willing to concede that every fear is about a fear of loss of control, mainly because I want to hold on to some of my own irrational fears. I do fear that the rhythm is going to get me someday. Okay, maybe you better work better at the next service, has more of my generation there. Sorry. You never know how it's going to work until you throw it out there. But I do think that Lucado is right. It has something to do with control. And I, for one, can say that when I lose control of a situation, I don't deal with it very well. I want to get control back, either by leaving this situation, that's that flight piece, or by trying to gain some control of the situation back. Think about all the presidential candidates, all the things they're telling us that are wrong. Most of them are about control. Things that we've lost control of, things that we should have control of, things that we maybe never had control of, but that we should have control of. And their solution is how are we going to gain control of that, or at least have the appearance that we've gained control of those things. And that's the biggest problem with fear, is it wants to lead to control. Lucado says That when we begin to fear, when we've lost control, then we seek control and safety becomes our God. It becomes the thing we search after and seek after rather than seeking after God. And worse, it means we seek to live a risk-free life. And you can't have lots of good things in life without some risk. Love, for example. We say it's better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. That's a risk that we have to take to engage in love. So if we want control, no love. Faith is about risk. We don't talk about taking leaps of safety. Right? You take leaps of faith. That's a risk involved. So if we're seeking safety and control in our lives, we lose love and faith right off the top. Because those are risky activities. So it's not really about not being afraid, but it's about how do we work through our fear to take risks in our lives. And that leads us then to the passage from Matthew that we heard. The passage starts with an interesting line that's sort of easy to overlook, and that is that we're told that Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. He makes them get into the boat. So immediately they've lost control. So if Lucado is right, they're instantly fearful in this situation. And why does Jesus have to make them get into the boat? Because in the 8th chapter of Matthew, they get in a boat with Jesus and they go out at night, same setup, and a huge storm overcomes them. Actually, the Greek, in the Hebrew word there is actually says an earthquake on the water occurs. And so they're terrified. And Jesus has to calm the storm. And so they're thinking about that last time they got on a boat. You remember what happened last time we got on a boat? You really want us to do that again? They're rightfully afraid. I can identify with that. There have been things that happen to say, yeah, I don't really think I want to do that again. Thank you very much. But Jesus makes them get in the boat. And this time, Jesus isn't going to be with them when they're out in the boats. And so they get out there. And they worked past that first step. I think we should give the disciples some credit. They moved past their fear to get in the boat. But they get out there and exactly what they were fearful of happens. Another storm comes up on them. And so the bad news is just because you work through one step of fear doesn't mean that what you're fearful of isn't actually going to happen to you. Disciples feared a storm, and a storm comes. But they're working on moving past it. And then they see this dark figure coming to them across the water. And we're told that they're terrified. And so imagine this. Imagine if this was a movie. It's night, and they're on a boat with a huge storm, and this figure comes out of them out of the darkness. Wouldn't you be scared? I'd be scared. I think they have every right to be terrified. The story is set up for them to be scared, but Jesus says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Now, my oldest daughter, Samantha, has one of the biggest hearts of anybody I know. She is the one who's going to reach out, is always concerned about what's going on in people's lives, how they're feeling. If she sees somebody who's alone or having a bad day, she's going to be the one who goes over there and talks to them. She's even nice to the people who are mean to her. But of our two, she is also the most hesitant of them. Abigail has no fear. She's going to go off and do her thing. Samantha is very timid when it comes to some things. So she has to constantly be working past her fears to try and do new things. Even when doing that is going to confirm all the fears she had, such as getting on a roller coaster. You can't really see, I should have made that a little bit bigger, how scared and screaming she is in that picture. But she knows that if she doesn't get past that fear, she'll miss that one piece. And so she's working constantly to get past it and to move out and do bigger and better things. And I do have her permission to tell this story. I'm not telling stories outside of school. So again, it's not about not being afraid. She's terrified on that roller coaster. I don't think she'd go on it again, but she can at least say, I did it. She moves past that fear to something bigger and better. One of the big phrases in the business world these days is about leaning in. Comes from the title of a book by Sheryl Sandberg, the CEO of Facebook. And when we're afraid, we lean back from it. We shy away, we pull away. It's how we then begin to approach the world. But when we lean into something, it's an entirely different perspective. Even if we're still afraid, when we lean in, the world leans in with us. When we pull back, the world pulls back from us. And the most important piece for us as Christians, when we think about fear, is it should be easier for us than most people because we know Christ. That we have Jesus. That's what changes Peter in that situation. Because when Peter sees that it's Jesus, I've said Peter's the impetuous one, he not only is sort of excited, but he decides to do something really kind of stupid. He says that if it's really you, ask me to come out of the boat too. Jesus says, come. So Peter steps out of the boat in a storm. And for a brief moment, he does the impossible. He walks on water. Now Peter gets frightened again, and he begins to sink. And Jesus says, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Next week we look at doubt. I don't think that his doubt there has anything to do with the reason he sank, but he cries out to Jesus, save me, as if Jesus wouldn't do that automatically. I think that's where the doubt that he gets chastised for is not that he's sinking, because he's already attempted to do the impossible. He's already attempted to work past his fear, because he knows that Christ is there. Which means that if we're going to overcome our fears, we can't be afraid of getting a little wet. If we're going to step out of the boat, we're going to get wet. Stepping out does not mean that the storm is suddenly calmed. The waves are still there, the wind is still there, but Peter does it anyways. Because he knows that Christ is there and Christ is calling to him, come. Now, in regards to this passage, Bishop Will Willimon said, if Peter had not ventured forth, had not obeyed the call to walk on water, then Peter would never have had this great opportunity to be rescued by Jesus. I wonder if too many of us are merely splashing about in the safe shallows, and therefore have too few opportunities to test and deepen our faith. If you want to be close to Jesus, you have to venture forth out into the sea. If you want to encounter Christ and move past your fears, you have to be willing to step out of the boat. And then there's one other key piece of information that happens in Peter's story, is that by overcoming his own fear, not only is his faith changed, but the faith of all the disciples on the boat is also changed. Because Jesus and Peter then climb into the boat, and what do? They bow down. All of them bow down and worship. They're no longer terrified. They're no longer scared. Peter's courage changed them as well. Which means that when we are fearful to do something, and we don't step beyond to do it, not only is our faith damaged, but we might be hindering the faith of those who look to us as the example. Courage is not about having no fear, it's about working past your fears. To do not what can't be done, to do what might be. And what we read in 1 Timothy is that God has not given us a spirit of fear. God has not given us a spirit of fear. Instead, we are called to recognize our fear and to know that Jesus is right there with us. Not in the boat with us. He's outside the boat saying, come on, step out. Come my way. And to do that, to overcome our fears, there are some simple steps. The first is that we have to name our fear. The girls and I are currently reading Harry Potter together. And for those unfamiliar with the story, Harry Potter's arch nemesis is Voldemort. But only two people in the books can say the name, Harry and the head of the school, Albus Dumbledore. And what Dumbledore says is, when they can't say Voldemort's name, they give him more power than he already has. Their fear becomes bigger and greater than it was because they can't even name what their fear is. So name your fear. What is it that's keeping you from doing something? And not just say it in your head. Say it out loud. Write it down on a piece of paper. And be specific about it. Don't say, I'm afraid of flying. What is it about flying? Is it that you're not flying the plane so you've lost control? Are you afraid of heights? Are you afraid of crashing? Are you afraid of flight attendants? Are you afraid of small seats? Name what it is that's making you fearful. And I'm not trying to demean this. Fear can be debilitating. But the way to get past it is to name it. To bring it outside of the darkness where fear dwells. And the second is to sort of play a worst case scenario. If what you feared came true, what would happen? Now, your worst case might be you died. But is that likely? No. And if you do, well, you can celebrate too, because we're an Easter people. Right? We're promised eternal life. But normally by saying what the worst case scenario, that too sort of diminishes sort of the power it has over us, because we think, well, that's not really as bad as I imagined it would be. And finally is to tell someone else your fears. Someone you trust. Don't go out to some stranger on the street or somebody who likes to make fun of you and tell them what you fear. But to tell them your fear. First, because they might be able to help you work through that. They might be able to say to you, is that really a rational fear? Where's that coming from? And maybe it's one you can't get over. But they can help you carry that burden that you have. But what those do is they help bring our fears out of the darkness. Because that's what feeds fear, is darkness. Disciples were on the boat at night. If they had been out there in the day, you think they would have been as scared? If they had seen Jesus walking across the water in the day, would they have been as scared? Probably not. It's because it happens in the darkness. Because that's where fear dwells. But that's exactly the point of what Christ does for us, and why we should not fear because of Christ. So I'm going to ask Chris and Muffy if you'll volunteer here for me. That's what happens when you sit in the front row.
We'll do that again.
So I need one of you to hold this piece of paper. Can you give that, Muffy? No, you're going to have to hold the flashlight, Chris. Oh. So come up here, Muffy. You're going to hold the flashlight there, and hopefully this is going to work. So we can sort of make our, shadow animals. Everybody see? Right? So if I put this in front of this, you can see the candle holder. But when I light the flame, there's no shadow. What we read in 1 John, this is the message I have heard from him who proclaims to you that God is light and in him there is no darkness at all. When we cast a shadow, it's blocking off the light. There's darkness. But when we light the flame, there is no darkness at all. Jesus is the light of the world. Come to our darkness. So why are we fearful? The light is here. It casts no darkness. Christ is calling to us. Come out of the boat. Get rid of your fear. Because fear dwells in that darkness. I am the light. There is no darkness with me. We are an Easter people. We don't believe in the power of the tomb. We don't believe in the power of death. We don't believe in the power of fear. We believe in the power of the lights. And in him there is no darkness at all. So you guys can sit down. Why don't you have to stand there for the rest of the message? So think about the things that you're fearing. What do you fear? That's your storm. That's your boat. What do you need to be able to move past that, to be able to say, I'm ready to step out? Ready to say to Christ, if it's really you, call me to come. And Jesus says, come. And obey that entire process in prayer, because that's what Jesus did. What does he do when the disciples are going out onto the water? He's out praying. The story immediately before this is the feeding of the 5,000. What happens immediately before he feeds the 5,000? He prays. So we are to bathe this process in moving past our fears in prayer as well. Not just asking for God to remove the fear, although that'd be great. But more, how do we step through our fear? How do we lean in and move forward? To know that Christ is present for us, not there terrified in the boat with us, but Christ is outside of the boat saying, come to me. He is the light shining in the darkness, casting no shadow, saying, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. I pray that it will be so, my brothers and sisters.